The wind comes first. It doesn't howl, not yet. It just drags its frozen fingers across the wooden walls of the sleeping settlement, rattling loose hides that cover the narrow windows. You wake before the light, not because you want to, but because the air inside the room has turned sharp and heavy. Your breath clouds the space before your face, and for a moment, you can see the rhythm of your own existence, a faint mist rising and vanishing in the dark. Outside, somewhere beneath the brittle crust of snow, a dog gives a half-hearted bark, the kind that means nothing more than I am here. The trading post sits against a frozen inlet, its shoreline stiff with ice and frost-bitten reeds. The sea itself lies silent, half-frozen and unmoving, a dark sheet beyond the pale rim of land. You pull your fur cloak tighter, careful not to disturb the frost that has gathered along the edges of the door. It will fall like salt when you open it. This is Hafenvik, one of the countless small Viking trade posts scattered across the northern seas around the 9th century. It's not one of the great towns, no bustling marketplace like Hedeby or Birka, but a smaller satellite, a day's sail away from the open sea. Its purpose is not glory nor conquest, but exchange. Fish for grain, furs for metal, amber for salt. Here men trade more to survive than to become rich. The air outside smells of iron and smoke. You can hear the sea breathing beneath the ice, small cracks expanding and contracting like sighs. The first figures begin to move through the gray morning, men with heavy boots, faces wrapped in wool, women pulling sleds piled with frozen cod, barrels sealed with tar and cloth-wrapped bundles of smoked meat. They do not talk much. The day begins not with songs, but with quiet endurance. Inside one of the larger buildings, a longhouse darkened by years of soot, a hearth glows faintly. A man named Einar, one of the post's founders, leans over the embers. His beard has gathered bits of frost. He is not a chief, not in the way the sagas describe. He is simply the one who stayed when others left. His job is to keep the trade going, to make sure the men from the inland valleys can exchange their goods for salt and tools when the ships arrive in spring. The hall smells of everything: tar, fish oil, dried herbs, and smoke that has nowhere to go. You sit near the hearth, watching the light flicker across the walls. Each plank of wood carries a memory, brought from distant forests, shipped across in small boats, hammered into place with iron nails that took weeks to forge. The walls are alive with stains: ash, grease, fingerprints, soot, the invisible residue of decades. A woman named Fridas enters, carrying a clay bowl. She nods but doesn't smile. You take a sip. It's thin porridge, barley with fragments of dried seaweed. Salt gives it flavor, if you can call it that. This is breakfast for the North. The conversation begins not with words, but with the scraping of spoons and the crackle of fire. Eventually, Einar speaks. 2 ships were seen in the fjord, he says. They'll not reach us till the ice breaks. Maybe a fortnight, the others nod. The post has enough dried food for 3 weeks, if rationed. After that, they'll start trading inland again. The life here is a cycle of waiting. Waiting for ships, waiting for thaw, waiting for luck. Outside, the wind picks up. Snow drifts between the huts, covering footprints that were made only minutes ago. You walk toward the storage shed, the largest structure in the post, made from overlapping timbers and sealed with pine tar. Inside are furs, fox, otter, seal, and sacks of coarse salt from the south. There's amber wrapped in wool, too, glowing faintly even in the dim light. These are the treasures of this world, though they don't look it. Nothing glitters here. Everything is dull, practical, preserved. A young man named Kjell joins you, carrying a small axe. He is only 30, but looks older. His hands are cracked, his skin the color of wood smoke. He checks the bindings on the barrels, then looks at you. Storm coming, he mutters. You glance toward the horizon. The clouds are gathering low, a heavy wall of gray pressing down upon the sea. The smell of the air changes. The cold grows sharper, more metallic. Even the dogs go quiet. That afternoon, the trading post retreats inward. Doors are latched, fires built higher. Men repair cloaks and tools. Someone hums softly, a tune about a ship that never returned. It's not sung with sorrow, just habit. Stories here are not told to entertain. They are told to remember that others endured the same. As the storm arrives, the sound is immense. The wind doesn't whistle. It roars, wrapping around the buildings, forcing smoke down through the roof holes. The sea, even half-frozen, groans. Snow comes sideways, plastering itself against walls and faces. The air outside disappears into white. Inside the hall, Einar stands, looking at the door that trembles in its frame. "She'll hold," he says. He's talking about the post itself, though it sounds like a prayer. The others nod again. In this world, faith is measured in the things you build yourself. The night is long. You listen to the timbers creak. Somewhere outside, a roof tile breaks free and vanishes into the snow. Hours later, when the wind finally softens, you realize the hall smells faintly of pine and damp ash. People begin to stir. The storm has passed. When morning comes, the post looks different. Snowdrifts reach the windowsills. The shoreline has vanished under ice. But there is a kind of peace in it, too, the quiet that follows survival. You step outside and breathe air so cold it hurts your chest. It tastes of salt and wood smoke and iron. Somewhere, a raven lands on a fence post black against the endless white. Life in the outpost resumes as if nothing happened. The storm will be remembered only for what it didn't take. That's how survival works here. What remains is what matters. Later that day, Einar gathers the traders. He spreads out a rough piece of parchment, a map drawn with charcoal lines. "The inland roads are open again," he says. "We'll send 2 sleds. One for furs, one for word." He means news. In a world this far north, news is as valuable as grain. Who still lives? Who has died? Which paths are frozen? Which chieftain is warring and which has made peace? Word keeps people connected when the sea cannot. You offer to go with Kjell on the inland route. The path leads through frozen marshes and the low birch forests that border the valley. Before you leave, Freydis hands you a strip of dried fish. "For the silence," she says, almost as if it's a blessing. By midday, you and Kjell are far from the post, pulling the sled by hand along the ridge. The wind is calmer here, the sun low but bright. You can see the sea in the distance, glinting faintly through breaks in the clouds. "Do you think the ships will come?" You ask. He shrugs. "They always do, unless they don't." The two of you walk for hours. The only sounds are the crunch of boots and the soft drag of wood on snow. Sometimes you think about the world beyond, the places where the salt comes from, where metal is mined, where amber is gathered by warmer hands. But here everything feels still, eternal. The north does not change quickly. By evening you reach a frozen stream. You build a small fire from birch bark and wait for the stars to appear. The light reflects off the snow, turning the world silver. You can hear the distant groan of the sea ice shifting miles away. It sounds like something alive. Kjell stares into the fire. "I've been here 10 winters, he says. "Before that I thought trade would make me rich. But all it does is keep me alive. Same as the sea, same as the wind." You don't answer. The flames flicker against his face, revealing lines etched deep by cold and time. For a moment it's easy to imagine that nothing beyond this place exists, that the world ends where the ice begins. Somewhere in the night. A crack echoes from the distance, ice breaking or maybe something moving upon it. You listen until the sound fades. The fire burns low. You think of Hafnvik, the tiny outpost by the sea waiting for your return. You think of the barrels, the furs, the salt, the map on Einar's table. You think of how every piece of survival here depends on another. Each trade, each path, each fragile decision. And as the stars drift overhead, you wonder almost absently, what happens to a place when the ships stop coming? The next morning, the fire has gone out. Only a thin thread of smoke curls upward from the blackened birch bark. The cold has reclaimed everything. Your breath hangs in the air like mist. Kjell is already awake, sharpening his knife with slow, careful strokes. The sound, steel against stone, is steady, rhythmic, the only pulse in the silence. You rise and stretch, joints stiff from sleep. The sled lies half buried under a light crust of snow. Overnight, frost has painted every surface in delicate white threads as if the world were wrapped in glass. Somewhere in the distance, a raven croaks once, then again. Kjell glances toward the sound but says nothing. Ravens always mean something here. Omens, travelers, or the gods' casual observers. Nobody agrees which. You begin walking again, the sled creaking softly behind. The inland path is narrow, lined with birch trees whose pale trunks look like bones. Every step sinks slightly into the snow, releasing faint whispers of trapped air. The land tilts upward toward a ridge that overlooks the valley. From there, you can see the faint smoke of distant farms, small clusters of humans clinging to life against the cold. That's where you'll trade the furs for grain and perhaps hear news from the south. The rhythm of travel becomes its own language. Breath, step, drag, pause. Kjell hums sometimes, fragments of old songs with no melody left. The sun barely climbs above the horizon. a dull orange disk behind a veil of gray. The day itself feels tired. By mid-afternoon, you reach the edge of a frozen marsh. The ice here is uneven, thick in some places, fragile in others. Kjell tests it with the butt of his axe before stepping forward. The sound of cracking makes your stomach tighten, but he crosses safely. You follow carefully, dragging the sled behind. In the stillness, every sound seems louder. The creak of rope, the groan of ice, the distant call of a bird you cannot name. Halfway across, the ice moans. You freeze, waiting, then silence again. You both exhale. The North tests everyone like this, not with storms or war, but with small moments of doubt. Surviving means learning to keep walking anyway. When you finally reach the other side, the relief is quiet. Kjell grins faintly and shakes his head. The gods like to watch us dance, he says. You smile, though your teeth ache from cold. You travel another hour before finding shelter. An abandoned way hut built from stone and turf, probably left by hunters seasons ago. Inside, the air is still and stale but dry. You clear a space near the center, light a small fire, and warm your hands. The flames throw slow golden light across the rough walls. Someone once carved a pattern here. Runes too faint to read now, worn smooth by time. You trace them with your finger, feeling the faint grooves. Kjell watches, then shrugs. Names, maybe? Or prayers. He unwraps a bundle of dried meat and divides it in two. As you eat, he begins to talk. Not stories of battle or gods, but of trade. The boring kind. The necessary kind. Salt from the south, he says. That's the most precious. Without it, the fish rots. Without fish, the people starve. So we trade furs, amber, bone carvings, anything the southerners think beautiful, for something that only tastes of the sea. You ask about the ships. They come from Ribe, sometimes Hedeby. Big ones with dragon heads, small ones without. They bring not just salt but stories, news of kings and monks, of new gods spreading across the lands. He spits into the fire. Those monks, he mutters. They talk about peace, but they never trade fairly. You realize then how much the outpost depends on things beyond its control. One storm, one lost ship, and the balance shifts. Every life here is measured against distance and weather. As night falls again, you lie awake, listening to the soft hiss of snow against the roof. You think of Einar and Freydis, of the small fire still burning in Hafenvik, and of the sea beyond. The world feels both enormous and small at once, a frozen circle of waiting and need. The next day brings clear skies, a rare gift. You and Kjell follow the frozen stream toward the valley. The light is sharper now, the snow glittering like ground glass. Around midday, you pass a solitary wooden marker carved with runes, the sign of a boundary. Beyond it lies the territory of the inland farmers. The smell of smoke drifts faintly through the air. Civilization, or something like it. You reach a cluster of huts by dusk. The people here look suspicious at first. Strangers are rare in winter. But when Kjell calls out in the old tongue and mentions Hafenvik, their faces soften. You're invited inside one of the huts, low-roofed and warm. The air inside is thick with the smell of peat smoke and boiled grain. A woman named Thora ladles porridge into wooden bowls. She listens as Kjell explains their need for barley and oats, their offer of furs and salt. She nods slowly, her hands never stopping their work. Her husband, a man with one eye and hands like tree roots, examines the furs with silent approval. Trade in the north is not quick. It unfolds like weather. Words come slowly, offers are made and withdrawn, trust measured by how much silence both sides can tolerate. Eventually they agree. 2 sacks of barley, 1 of rye, in exchange for the finest fox pelt and a small pouch of amber. Kjell marks it on a scrap of birch bark with a piece of charcoal. Nothing is sealed with ink here, only memory. Later that night, you sit near the hearth watching sparks drift upward into the dark. The farmers tell stories, not of gods or kings, but of things that matter more. How the frost came early this year. How the river froze thicker than ever. How a neighbor's cow birthed twins. These are the chronicles of the real North. Quiet, repetitive, essential. You ask if they've heard news from the south. Thora nods. They say men in long robes are building a church near the coast, she says. They say they have a bell that can call across the water. She laughs softly. Perhaps it will wake the sea. Kjell doesn't laugh. He stares into the fire, lost in thought. When you step outside later, the sky has cleared completely. The stars are impossibly sharp, like holes punched in the night. You can see the faint shimmer of the northern lights, a pale green curtain that sways and trembles. The world feels older than words. The next morning, the sled is heavier with grain and your muscles ache with the effort of dragging it through the snow. But there is satisfaction in it, the quiet dignity of returning with what others need. When you crest the final ridge, Hafenvik appears below, a scatter of roofs and thin plumes of smoke against the white landscape. The sea lies beyond, motionless as if waiting. Einar meets you near the longhouse, eyes bright despite the cold. He inspects the grain, nodding once. "Good work," he says simply. Freydis brings out warm broth and you drink it greedily. It tastes of salt and smoke and home. The post feels alive again. Men repair nets, sharpen tools, mend sails. Someone found a patch of open water near the inlet, and a small boat has been dragged down to test the ice. Life resumes its slow rhythm, cautious but steady. That evening, Einar calls for a gathering inside the hall. Everyone sits close to the fire, faces glowing orange in the flicker. He lays the birch bark map on the table again, weighing down its corners with small stones. "We've heard from the valley," he says. "There's a new settlement farther inland. They've begun smelting iron. If we can trade with them come spring, Hafenvik might last another year." The murmur of voices rises, hope mixed with fatigue. You realize how fragile this place truly is. Every winter survived is a small miracle. Every trade route found a promise against disappearance. Kjell sits beside you, quiet as always. After the meeting, he leans closer. "Einar's right," he says. "But iron changes things. When the metal comes, so does the trouble." You ask what he means. "New weapons," he replies. "New reasons to fight. Trade brings wealth. Wealth brings war. Always has." You think about that as you step outside. The night air bites your face, but above you the aurora ripples faintly, green and white threads across a black sea of sky. The beauty of it is almost unbearable, and yet it means nothing. It's simply there, as it always has been. In the distance, you hear the faint crack of ice shifting along the shore. It sounds like laughter or breaking glass. Somewhere out there, the ships still wait for the thaw. Back inside, the hall grows quieter. Einar sits alone by the fire, carving something small, a piece of driftwood shaped into a tiny boat. He holds it up to the light. "For luck," he says softly, though he doesn't sound convinced. The sea decides who is lucky. You lie down near the warmth of the hearth, wrapped in fur. The smell of smoke clings to everything. Around you, the others sleep, breath slow and even. You stare at the ceiling, tracing the patterns of soot above. Every mark tells a story of a fire that kept someone alive another night. Outside, snow begins to fall again, slow, soft, endless. And you wonder, as sleep takes you, what happens when the ice finally melts, and strangers find the forgotten harbor of Hafenvik? The thaw comes slowly, not as a single day of warmth, but as a series of uncertain changes. The ice softens, then hardens again. Snow turns to slush, then freezes once more overnight. The air carries the faint scent of wet earth, strange and heavy after months of salt and smoke. The sounds of the settlement shift too. Less creaking wood, more dripping water, more quiet footsteps outside as people test the new ground. You wake one morning to find the edge of the sea shimmering under a weak sun. The ice is cracked open in long black lines, and pools of seawater glisten between them like dark glass. Einar stands on the shore, arms folded, eyes scanning the horizon. "It begins," he says. You know what he means, the waiting for ships is nearly over. The trading post stirs with purpose. Nets are mended, sails checked, barrels resealed. The smell of tar grows thick in the air as men repair the hulls of small boats that were trapped on land all winter. The women lay out fish to dry on racks, their fingers red from the cold water. The dogs bark again, sharp, impatient sounds. Even the ravens seem louder. Days pass and the ice thins further. A path opens near the inlet, narrow and dangerous, but open all the same. A small boat is lowered into the water to test it. It creaks but holds. When it returns safely, Einar's face softens, just a little. There is still hope that the world beyond the ice remembers this place. That night, the hall is warmer than it's been in months. The fire burns high, the smoke drifting lazily through the roof hole. Kjell sits near the entrance, carving a new handle for his axe. Freydis hums as she stirs a pot of broth. The sound is soft, domestic, ordinary. It feels like something worth holding on to. Einar joins you by the fire. "You've been here a full winter now," he says. "That's more than most manage. You've seen how it is in the cold, the hunger, the waiting. Still want to stay?" You think for a moment. "It's quiet here," you say. "The world makes sense," he laughs, a dry sound. Quiet is what kills most men. They start hearing their own thoughts too clearly. He pokes the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks upward. But maybe you're the kind who listens well. You don't answer. Outside, wind moves softly through the rafters. Not the scream of winter, but a gentler sigh. Somewhere far off, a low creak echoes across the sea. It might be the sound of ice shifting, or of something larger cutting through it. The next morning, a cry goes up from the shoreline. A boy runs toward the hall, breathless. "Sails!" he shouts. Everyone stops what they're doing. Even the dogs freeze. For a moment, there's only silence, and the kind that comes when the world changes shape. You follow Einar to the shore. Far out, past the last shards of ice, a dark line moves slowly across the horizon. Then another. Two ships veer, long, narrow, their dragon-headed prows rising above the water. Sunlight catches on the wet wood, turning them briefly golden. They are smaller than warships, but larger than any boat in Hafenvik. Traders, perhaps. Survivors of other ports. The first to reach this frozen edge in months. A ripple of energy moves through the post. Fires are stoked higher, goods arranged, furs shaken free of dust. The long winter of waiting is over. By mid-afternoon, the ships reach the shallows. The men aboard them look exhausted, beards stiff with salt, eyes hollow. They call out greetings in the old tongue, voices hoarse. Ropes are thrown, barrels rolled onto the shore, laughter breaking through the fatigue. Einar meets the captain, a heavy-set man with gray hair and a scar down his cheek. His name is Olav. They clasp hands briefly, neither smiling. Inside the hall, trade begins again. Salt, metal tools, wine and wool from the south in exchange for furs, amber, and dried fish. The sound of voices fills the air. Slow, deliberate bargaining punctuated by short bursts of laughter. The smell of unfamiliar goods, foreign oils, herbs, tarred rope, mingles with the familiar smoke and fish. Hafenvik feels alive again, humming with the rhythm of survival. You watch as Einar and Olav speak quietly near the fire. Every trade carries with it a measure of news. From them, the outpost learns that Hedeby is thriving, that the southern kings grow richer with each passing year, and that more Christian traders are arriving from across the sea. They bring silver and crosses, Olav says, and talk of one God for all men. Some believe, most just trade. Einar listens without judgment. Belief in this place is another kind of currency. You give it or withhold it as needed. Later that evening, when the goods have been tallied and the fires burn low, the newcomers speak of storms farther north, ships lost, coastlines changed by ice. One man tells of a settlement swallowed by the sea after the tide rose higher than anyone remembered. Another claims he saw whales frozen in place near the fjord, their bodies trapped under clear ice. The stories drift through the hall like smoke, impossible to prove or deny. Kjell sits beside you, silent. When you glance at him, he murmurs, "We live at the edge of the world. The world is always trying to take it back." Over the next few days, the trading continues. You help load barrels, check ropes, carry sacks of grain from ship to shore. Your hands ache, your back burns, but there's satisfaction in it. Each task has purpose. Each movement feeds someone somewhere. At night, when the work slows, the hall fills with the quiet murmur of voices. Men carve wood or mend clothing by firelight. Freitas sings softly, a low tune that sounds older than language. It tells of waiting, of ships, of loved ones, of seasons that come and go. You don't know the words, but you understand the meaning. One evening, Olav approaches you. "You've stayed here all winter?" He asks. You nod. He studies you for a moment, then gestures toward the sea. Then you've seen what the North really is. It's not war or glory. It's patience, he pauses, and hunger if you miscount. He smiles, the faintest flicker of warmth in his tired eyes. You should come south sometime. The air there smells of grass, not salt. You think about it. The idea feels distant, almost impossible. The world beyond Hafenvik seems unreal now. Too loud, too bright. When Olav's ships finally leave, the entire post gathers on the shore to watch them fade into the mist. Their sails vanish one by one, swallowed by the gray horizon. The sea closes behind them without a trace. For a moment, the silence feels heavier than the cold ever was. Kjell breaks it first. "They'll come again," he says. "They always do." Einar nods, though his eyes linger on the water longer than the rest. You wonder if he believes it or simply needs to. Spring moves slowly north. The snow retreats, revealing the brown earth beneath. Small shoots of grass appear near the huts. The dogs shed their winter coats, scratching against the walls. Life begins to soften around the edges. Hoffenvik breathes again. You spend your days repairing the nets with Freitas, learning how to twist the coarse fibers so they hold against the weight of cod. She tells you that every knot has a name, though she only remembers a few. My father taught me before he sailed south, she says. He never came back. Maybe he liked the grass Olav spoke of. You ask if she's ever thought of leaving. She shakes her head. Someone has to stay. The sea always needs a witness. Her words stay with you. There is a strange kind of meaning in staying, in being the one who keeps the fire lit when others move on. One night, near the end of spring, you walk down to the shore alone. The sea is open now, its surface dark and restless. The wind carries the scent of salt and thawed earth. Behind you, Hoffenvik glows faintly under the low northern stars, just a handful of lights against the vast darkness. You listen to the waves. They sound like breathing. You think of everything that's passed, the storm, the silence, the long nights of waiting. You think of the small things that keep this place alive, fire, trade, memory, and you realize that history in places like this isn't made by kings or battles. It's made by the ones who keep the roof patched, who mend the nets, who endure. Far out at sea, something glimmers. Perhaps moonlight on a wave. Perhaps another sail. You can't tell. The world is full of things half seen, half known. You close your eyes, listening to the soft rhythm of water against ice, the endless dialogue between land and sea. Somewhere behind you, the hall door creaks open, then shuts again. Someone has added another log to the fire. In the morning, life will continue, quietly, persistently, beautifully dull. And centuries from now, when the ice has melted and the maps have changed, someone might dig through the frozen soil of this place and find what remains. A rusted nail, a fragment of pottery, a piece of amber wrapped in wool. They'll wonder who lived here, who traded, who waited by the frozen sea. They'll never know your name or Einar's, or Freitas's, but they'll know that life existed here, stubborn and cold and human. And perhaps they'll ask, softly, what other forgotten fires still burn beneath the snow. You wake to the smell of tar and drying fish, the faithful signatures of a northern harbor coming back to life after winter. The planked pier is slick with dew, and the shallow water below it holds yesterday's reflections. Ropes, ribs of hulls, the heavy curve of a beached boat whose seams gleam dark where pitch has just been warmed and pressed. You rub sleep from your eyes and feel the day's arithmetic settling into place. How many hands for the sail? How many hands for the oars? How many sacks of goods on the outbound run? And how many you hope to bring home? Trade, like weather, starts before the sun is properly up. The talk around you is not of kings or raids, but of furs and salt, of weight and measure, of the timber you'll need if a spar gives way out on the gray water. A man is checking the brass pans of a small balance scale, tapping the pins to make sure they don't stick. He makes a show of weighing a bent strip of silver against carved weights, then nods to himself in satisfaction. Silver will be the language wherever you go, chopped and nicked into hack silver as often as it is stamped into coins. It's not the prettiest language, but it is the most convincing when the wind shifts and friends become simply people you must do business with. You step aboard a shallow draft cargo boat whose broad belly is made for rivers and coasts, not deep sea. It has been caulked 3 times since the first frost and bears the black fingerprint smears of the shipwrights across its seams, a kind of winter manuscript written in tar. You help slide aboard the first of the outbound cargo, fox and marten furs wrapped in oiled wool, 2 bundles of coarse thread, a small chest of amber from the Baltic strand, raw and dull until you rub it with a bit of cloth, a packet of bone pins and combs, and a sealed jar of comb honey someone swears will fetch good exchange down the coast. There is nothing glamorous about any of it. Everything is useful. Everything is small. Everything is a hedge against the unexpected. The first leg of the journey is the familiar coast, shouldering past low points of rock where the sea pulls a slow breath and lets it out again. Inlets and coves mark the shoreline like commas. You pause, then push on. You know that farther south the wealth gathers in larger towns. Ribe on the Jutland sands with its long beach market. Hedeby tucked behind earthworks at a pinch point between seas. Birka sitting quiet on its island in Lake Malaren. Names spoken like prayer by people who hope to see them at least once before death. Between those names are the countless anonymous landfalls that make such names possible. Hidden creeks where you can tuck for the night. Shallow bars where you must walk the boat while cursing the cold. Farmstead piers where a family will sell you dried fish against a promise to bring back salt. Salt will not wait for poetry. It is the plainest substance and the most urgent. You carry it home in barrels whose hoops must be checked twice at every stop, because swollen wood loosens iron and drops months of labor into the bilge without ceremony. In the far north, some people boil seawater in iron pans and evaporate brine in shallow pits when the rare sun cooperates. But the strong, steady flow comes from the south. Coastal salterns where wind and heat do their patient work, and places where brine springs up from the ground and is driven off over fires in a rhythm older than any law. Salt preserves fish into stockfish or light-dried slabs, saves meat across seasons, tames butter, and makes winter less of an argument. You feel its necessity in the way hands reach for the barrels as soon as you bump a pier. When the wind fails, you take the oars and count. Counting is a way to make distance honest. You count to 30 for a minute of steady pulling, then count the minutes, then estimate shore to shore by how sore your shoulders feel. The men around you do the same and add up their own private sums. What a fox pelt can buy in grain from an inland farm, how far a sack of rye can stretch if the spring is late, how much silver to hold back in case a keel must be replaced. Trade is only partly goods. It is also time converted into choices. At a beach market near the mouth of a shallow river, you see the usual congregation. A tent of woven wool sheltering a chest of glass beads that look like bits of sky and marsh water. A smith with a traveling anvil and a boy working the bellows. A farmer's wife with 2 baskets of cheese and a face that says she will not haggle, because she already did the haggling with the cow. You learn the feel of prices the way you learn the feel of a tide. A marten pelt buys a small iron knife with a careless edge. 3 good foxes buy 2 sacks of coarse salt. A fist of amber buys a bronze brooch, then becomes silver when the man next to the brooch seller makes you an offer for the brooch. He's been hoping not to buy from his neighbor. Every number has a story behind it, and you watch those stories lean on one another until a price stands up. In a bigger town, the story changes scale. Hedeby is the kind of place where you can forget which language you're speaking until a trader's eyes go dull and you realize you've chosen the wrong one. The earthworks sit like a curled fist above the harbor, and inside the fist is a braided confusion of streets, workshops, and yards stacked with timber. You smell iron before you see it, a dull scent like weathered blood. There are barrels from the Frisian coast, wool from the islands, and pottery daubed in slips that no Northman would waste time on if people didn't keep buying them. Somewhere above it all, a bell rings from a church and nobody looks up. The sound has begun to enter the rhythm of business like any other sound. Hedeby is also where silver thickens. Men from the east bring arm rings and coins, dirhams from far-off caliphs with script that flows like water across their faces. Your fingers learn to test the bite of a coin against your teeth, to note the ring of silver dropped into a pan, to look for the bright fracture of a piece snapped off a larger ingot. Sometimes you see scales with weights carved as animals or simple lozenges, and you think how strange. It is that a winter's hunting and a summer's sailing can end in a pair of numbers, teased into agreement over a firelit table. The price of fur is not set in a single town and never will be. It begins in the cold where people who are not you do the hardest work. Sami hunters who know the winter ground like a map. Finnick traders who pull sleds across river ice by moonlight. Men in reed-lined huts on the White Sea who cut holes and wait. They move pelts through hands you'll never shake, and those hands add a little value at every border crossed. Somewhere between the first knife stroke and your scale pan, the fur becomes a measure of distance rather than an animal's warmth. You know this because if a supply thins, the price changes before the story explaining the change reaches you. You travel inland when you can because coasts cannot answer every question. Rivers solve problems quickly when they are in the right mood. Dvina, Dnieper, and Volga are words you hear like promises from mouths chapped by salt and wind. Up one river you can slide to lakes that slide to other rivers until the sea is behind you and the east opens, a chain of portages and shoves and prayers, where the keel grinds across moss and the men grunt and you feel history being paid for in bentbacks. There are places on those routes where the names wear 2 skins, Norse and Slavic, and both skins fit. A trader points at the bank and says Ladoga, with a shrug that also says Aldigjuborg, and you accept that a place is sometimes a conversation rather than a point. On those eastern lines, the silver gets brighter, and the silk gets quieter. The dirhams come in sacks that look like grain until you open them. They are new enough that many still shine, and you know that farther south in markets you will never see a man in a long robe, has moved counters on a table to make sure those coins reach the men, now counting them into your sack. You do not need to love the caliph to accept his arithmetic. You also see wax and honey by the weight. Bees work traveling better than most people do, and wax even more valuable after the monks' bells follow the trade routes and need steady light to swing at dawn and dusk. Salt on the inland roads behaves as it does on the coast, steady-faced and indispensable. It buys nothing by itself and everything when hunger circles. A farmer in a birch clearing gives you rye for a small barrel and tells you the winter's story in 6 sentences, none of them about glory. Another man wants iron nails more than salt, and will give you 2 sacks of oats if you add a comb for his wife. You do because combs travel well and nails are dear to replace when the smiths in the town ahead are busy taking orders from richer men. The arithmetic of small places is as precise as any carved weight. If you press too hard, you lose the next sale, and the quiet help men give each other when a cart axle snaps 15 miles from anyone's yard. The boats you meet shift with the water's character. On the wider rivers, flat punts carry stacks of furs under hide covers that shed sleet, and crews work with long poles rather than oars. On the lakes, men favor low, light hulls they can drag fast over a spit of sand if a wind tries to bully them onto a lee shore. On the coast proper, you see the long, lean ships whose fame outpaces their freight capacity, and the shorter, fuller-bellied craft that carry barrels instead of reputations. You learn to read a hull the way you read a man's face, where it has been, what it will complain about, how much coaxing it will need, and the wrong kind of chop. At every stop you hear fragments of laws that try to wrap themselves around trade. A man quotes a market rule from a town farther south that says coins must be clipped only at a certain bench. Another says weights are to be checked by the Reeves man every new moon. Someone else claims that in a place you have not visited, anyone who cheats at scales must parade with his false weights around his neck. The rules are an attempt to give business a memory beyond the men who carry it. In practice, memory also lives in the way a trader's name travels faster than his boat. If he cheats, his boat arrives with a story trailing behind it like kelp. The dull work saves you as often as skill does. You sleep with rope coiled under your head, not for comfort but so you know if a thief lifts it. You keep a spare pin for the steering oar wrapped in a bit of cloth in a pouch you never leave on deck. You check the pitch line before sunset and before sunrise, and you push a thumb into each seam until the pressure of that simple act becomes part of how your hand feels. You do not celebrate days when nothing happens, but you respect them, because trade rides on days that do not require stories. There are westward roads too, and you take them when the wind is stubborn, along the Frisian shore where marsh smell mixes with wool, up estuaries that pucker into markets on good ground, across to the islands where the sheep stare with the blank intensity of kings. In those places men bring cloth so fine you suspect it of lying about how long it will last, and you bring back what your own shore cannot make. Later, when men tell sagas full of raids and shining helmets, you will remember the longer lines of boats whose cargo was not fear but salt and cloth and cheap pottery, and you will think that fear buys headlines while the other boats paid the rent. Amber is the easiest cargo to love and the hardest to value. On some beaches it is common enough to seem a trick of the light, washed up in dull globs after storms and discovered by children who do not yet care what men pay for beauty. In towns far away it becomes more than itself. Carved beads strung for necks that will never smell the Baltic in winter. Inlays for boxes that will never be near water. A honeyed glow used to imitate the sun in places where the sky is too often crowded. You keep a few pieces, not because you believe in luck, but because touch matters, and a warm stone in a cold hand can remind you that trade is also a way of convincing your own body to continue. In late season, you turn for home with a boat that rides lower and minds the wind more. Barrels thump in a reassuring pattern when the swell sets up. Sacks of grain give off a smell you've come to think of as the promise of porridge. The small chest of silver makes very little sound at all, which is one of the things you like about silver. The crew speaks less as the familiar landmarks fall into their old order along the coast. Someone starts to plan the repairs for winter, and someone else, more careful, lists what must be saved to make it through a spring that might be stubborn again. When you make your own harbor, the pier looks the same as it did when you pushed into the gray light at the start, and you understand that the sameness is itself an achievement. You unload, you count, you bind, you note who gets what and why, and you tuck aside the small reserve for what no one can name yet. The post smells of smoke and tar and wet wool as always. Children watch with unembarrassed concentration as sacks pass from hand to hand. Dogs circle and decide they have no business to add to yours. The scale pans rock, again, settle again. Prices are not arguments so much as recognitions. Later, With the boat hauled up and the last barrel rolled into its dark corner, you sit on the pier with your feet above water that has gone almost black under an evening sky. You think about the line you traced, the invisible road strung between beach markets and great towns, between marsh and causeway, between the fragile places where law is a handshake and the larger places where law is a seal on a cord. You think about the way furs knit together people who will never meet, and how salt stitches one season to the next without asking anyone's permission. You think about the weight of a scale pan and the way a strip of silver can become bread, then muscle, then a hand on an oar carrying more silver toward a place where someone needs salt. You find yourself wondering not whether the trade will continue, it always does, in one form or another, but how the balance will shift when new bell towers rise on the harbors, when more eastern silver finds its way into western hands, when iron becomes cheaper than patience. You wonder as the pier cools under you and a gull makes a sound like a hinge in the distance. What unseen calculation, somewhere on a far-off coast or a quiet river landing, will change the price of fur here? And how many meals in your village will be measured by that change before you even hear the story behind it? The summer air inland feels different, thicker with the smell of pine and damp moss. The boat has been pulled far up the riverbank, its ribs resting on rolled logs while the crew unloads the last barrels of salt. The tide of goods moves the other way now, toward the interior. Trade does not stop at the edge of the sea. It only changes its accent. A track of beaten earth leads away from the landing. You join the small caravan. 3 sledges refitted with wheels, 6 oxen and 8 men from different tongues. A Dane hums under his breath. A Finn carries a bow that never leaves his shoulder. A Rus trader counts beads on a string the way others count coins. Nobody leads for long, each knows a part of the road and none the whole. The route is older than any of you. It begins as a clearing, becomes a rutted lane, turns to boardwalks over bog, then back to dirt. You see where travelers before you cut branches to mark safe ground. Every so often there is a wooden post carved with shallow symbols. Ownership marks, border prayers, or maybe just the memory of a toll once paid. Each post means that men tried to measure this wildness and mostly failed. The goods creak and shift. Furs ride easy, light and dry, packed in layers of bark to keep out moisture. Salt is heavier, jealous of every jolt. Barrels strain against their hoops on the rough ground. The oxen snort and pull. When the mud gets deep, everyone pushes until the wheels bite again. Trade has no patience for pride. At night, the camp smells of smoke and resin. You share dried fish soaked in weak ale and chew slowly, letting silence settle. The Finn sharpens his knife with small, patient strokes. Across the fire, the Rus trader begins to talk of the East. How the rivers there run like roads. How men slide their boats across strips of land only a mile wide to reach the next stream. He says there are cities beyond forests where gold shines in temple domes and people drink wine from glass. You know half of it is dream, yet the words feel warm against the night air. In the morning you move again, through forests that whisper but never quite speak. You learn to read them. The sound of a squirrel means the trail is safe. The sudden silence of birds means something larger is near. Once far off, you hear wolves. No one looks back. The caravan keeps moving, steady as breathing. By the 4th day, the road widens into a river meadow dotted with huts.
Smoke drifts from clay chimneys, and children stop their play to stare at the strangers.
The elder who greets you wears a necklace of boar tusks and smells faintly of tar. His words come slow but friendly. He has seen traders before, though not this early in the season. The barter begins without fuss. You set out your sample pelts, fox, otter, marten. The elder touches them like a priest reading scripture. His people live where the cold deepens sooner, and they know the worth of warmth. In return, they offer bundles of beeswax wrapped in birch bark and slabs of tanned hide strong enough for sails. You weigh, nod, adjust. Silver appears only at the end when no other measure will do. A coin changes hands, hacked, bent, its face half gone, and the elder holds it up to the light as if testing the truth of the metal. Trade finished. You are invited to stay for the night. In their largest hut, the smoke hangs thick enough to write in. Women tend a pot that smells of broth and forest herbs. Children edge close, eyes wide at the sight of the foreigners. The talk drifts from prices to stories. A hunter tells of a white bear that walks upright like a man. Another swears that far north the sun forgets to rise for weeks. You listen, not to learn but to understand how people explain a world that mostly ignores them. Before dawn, you are moving again. The land begins to slope upward. The oxen struggle. Men put their shoulders to the wheels. The Finn finds a stream to follow, one that will lead to a larger river where boats wait. The rivers are the veins of this world. Salt, fur, iron, and rumor all flow along them, joining and dividing like blood. When you reach the bank, you see boats already loading. Narrow dugouts hollowed from pine, some fitted with low planks to raise their sides. Goods move from sledge to boat with practiced rhythm. You push off and the current takes you east. Days on the water blend together. Each bend looks like the last until something small, an outcrop of stone, a heron rising from the reeds, breaks the spell. You learn to steer by smell as much as sight. Fresh pine means a tributary. Brine means you are nearing a larger lake. Sometimes you pass other traders, their hulls low, their eyes wary but not unfriendly. A nod replaces speech. The river itself is conversation enough. At a wider stretch, you stop at a riverside market. The place barely exists. 3 huts, 2 boats pulled onto shore, a rough platform of planks serving as both dock and stall. Yet word of it travels days ahead and behind because it marks where north meets south. You trade the last of the furs for bars of raw iron, heavy and cold. The smiths who shaped them are far away, but their labor rides in your hold now, destined for someone who will hammer it thin and bright. While others haggle, you wander. At the edge of the market, a man sits beside a small chest lined with cloth. Inside lie coins from places whose names sound like coughs. The faces on them are strange, sharp-nosed rulers curling letters. You pick up one, silver-worn smooth at the edges. The man says it came from the far side of the world where men pray facing east. You hand it back carefully. The coin is heavier than it should be, as if it remembers the miles. That night the campfire's light slides over piles of traded goods: wax, iron, cloth, salt. The air smells of pitch and riverweed. Someone hums an old sea tune even though the nearest tide is hundreds of miles away. You realize how far the sea's logic extends inland, carried on backs and in boats, the rhythm of give and take echoing wherever people need one another to survive. Morning brings fog thick enough to erase the opposite bank. You drift in near silence, trusting the current. The sound of paddles is muffled, dreamlike. When the fog lifts, you see a settlement of log houses clustered around a small wooden church. Its cross is plain, its walls still bright from fresh-cut pine. Men with clipped hair and iron crosses at their necks stand near the landing. Their speech is familiar yet softened by another tongue. They trade but differently. Weights and ledgers, less talk, more marks on parchment. You feel the age of things shifting. Trade is learning to write itself down. One of the priests approaches, smiling without warmth. He asks what you carry. You list the goods and he nods, touching the cross as if counting them in prayer. He offers wax and cloth in exchange for salt and iron, fair terms. Before you leave, he presses a small wooden token into your hand. For passage, he says. On one side is carved a simple cross, on the other a ship. You turn it over and wonder which face carries more weight. Downriver, the landscape flattens again. You pass through miles of reeds where the air buzzes with unseen insects. The river widens into a lake, the water green with depth. On its far shore, another town rises, larger, noisier. Bells again, but lower, thicker, metal speaking to water. Here, eastern traders meet those from the north, and the market spreads like a field of color. Bright cloth from the south, dark furs from the forests, glinting metal, slabs of salt that sparkle in the sun. It smells of fish oil, smoke, sweat, and money. You spend 3 days there. On the first, you sell half your cargo. On the second, you buy spices you can barely name, pepper, maybe, or something like it, because someone down the coast will pay more than you did. On the third, you sit alone at the edge of the quay and watch the water curl under the hulls. You realize that every path you have taken, every bargain made, is one thread in a net too large to see. The same hands that gut fish in Hafenvik depend on silver that once glittered under a desert sun. The return begins quietly. The current helps, but the loads are lighter now. You travel mostly in silence, minds already at home. The Finn counts the trees aloud, marking where he'll cut bark for next year's canoes. The Russ hums again. At night, the stars look sharper, perhaps because you have fewer questions left to ask. When the river bends toward the west, you smell the salt wind long before you see the sea. The horizon widens. The air feels cleaner. Hafenvik is days away, but its memory walks beside you. You imagine Einar checking the scales, Freda stirring her pot, the dogs barking as sails appear at the inlet. You think of the barrels of salt that will land there soon, of the hands that will lift them, of the meals and the winters they will make possible. Yet as you near the coast, a thought keeps circling. the priest's token still in your pouch. One face promises passage, the other trade. Both are carved from the same wood. You turn it between your fingers, hearing the faint rasp of grain. You wonder which side will matter when the next tide rises, faith or exchange, prayer or salt. The boat slides into familiar waters as the sun dips low, a long red smear across the west. The men fall quiet. Ahead, smoke from the outpost climbs straight up into the calm evening air. You know that tomorrow will be spent unloading, measuring, and speaking the same slow language of barter you have spoken all your life. The road of fur and salt never ends. It only pauses for breath, and you ask yourself, as the first gull wheels overhead and the scent of the frozen sea reaches you again, what will happen to all these roads when men begin to count their souls with the same care they count their silver? By midsummer, the outpost hums again. The harbor mud is black and soft under bare feet, and gulls pick at scraps left from the last unloading. The air carries two smells, smoke from the drying racks and the sharp, clean bite of salt water. You have come full circle, though nothing feels precisely the same. The road, the river, the faces along them, each has left a small residue, a faint dust of difference that clings the way brine does after the tide pulls back. Einar meets you at the pier with the familiar half-smile of a man counting before he speaks. He looks older than when you left. Perhaps it's the new season's light drawing every line deeper. Behind him, Fridas shades her eyes, calling for the others to bring the carts. There is no ceremony, only motion. Ropes tossed, barrels rolled, the low grunt of men hauling the boat higher on the beach. Trade begins to dissolve into work before anyone names it. Inside the hall, the new goods make their own kind of music, the scrape of iron bars, the dull thump of wax blocks stacked like bricks, the whisper of grain pouring from sack to bin. Einar notes everything on strips of birch bark. He never writes numbers, only marks. A cross for 10, a circle for 20, a line through the circle when the trade is done. His system is older than he is and more trustworthy than memory. Each mark is a winter spared. That evening, after the last barrel is stowed, the hall settles into its usual low murmur. Smoke hangs under the rafters and the fire paints every face the same shade of copper. Kjell sits sharpening an awl. Freydis plucks bits of wax from a crate and sets them aside to trade with the priest who now visits from the southern coast twice a year. The priest brings news, always more news than anyone asks for. He arrives 2 days later, thin as driftwood, his cloak heavy with travel dust. Around his neck, the iron cross swings like ballast. He greets the settlement in the same way he always does. A blessing for the sea, a word for the dead, a question about salt. His Latin sounds like the creak of rope, but his silver is good. He wants wax for candles, grain for his church, and always more stories from the north to take back to his bishop. The people there, he says, love to hear of your endurance. It reminds them to pray harder. Einar listens, polite but distant. We trade, Father, he answers. Prayers do not keep fish. The priest smiles as if that too is a kind of faith. Later, when the hall has quieted, you sit with him near the fire. He speaks of changes farther south, markets marked by law, coins stamped with crosses, kings measuring their worth by the number of churches built along their ports. The old gods fade, he says. Even your silver carries their memory, but the new silver carries ours. He turns a coin between his fingers, a bright, thin piece bearing a ruler's face instead of a rune. Soon every weight will have a witness. You look at the coin and think of the scales in Hedeby, of the way a man's name still travels faster than his measure. The priest's witness is metal. Yours has always been memory. Neither is infallible. When he leaves, taking his wax and grain, he presses another wooden token into your hand. This one bears only the cross. The ship has sailed off the other side, he says. You will not need it now. He means it kindly, but the words feel like a closing door. Days slide into weeks. The rhythm of the post returns, boats come, boats go, voices rise and fall around the scales. Salt barrels leave, furs arrive, silver clinks and disappears again into hidden pouches. It is life stripped to exchange, and yet within it you sense something stirring. An unease, a quiet awareness that the very road you have walked for years is changing shape. A stranger from the east confirms it. He arrives on a narrow boat trimmed in red paint, speaking a blend of tongues none of you catch fully. His cargo is silk so fine it moves like smoke when unrolled. He asks not for furs or salt but for iron and nails. The rivers are opening farther south, he explains through gestures. New towns, New rules. He points at the horizon as though the line itself were shifting. Einar nods the way a man nods to a storm he cannot prevent. That night you walk to the shore. The air is thick with midsummer gnats. Their wine threads through the silence. The tide is low, leaving a mirror of wet sand. You trace lines in it with a stick, coastlines, rivers, the invisible routes you've traveled. When the wind dries the surface, the lines fade. You draw them again, knowing they will fade once more. It occurs to you that this is how the North keeps its history. Drawn each season, erased each season, remembered only by those who keep drawing. Autumn comes quietly. The light tilts. The fish grow scarce, and traders begin to speak of leaving before the ice closes. You help repair hulls and pack goods for winter, the work almost comforting in its repetition. Yet every task feels heavier this time, as though you're preparing not just for cold but for change. Kel senses it too. The roads will shift, he says while hammering a nail into the hull. Not vanish, just bent. The priests will bless the markets, and the markets will bless the priests. We'll still trade, but the stories will belong to them. You nod. And us? He shrugs. We'll be the echo. The first snow arrives early. The flakes are large, soft, confident. You stand at the doorway of the hall and watch them blur the horizon. Inside, the last of the wax burns low, scenting the air with honey. The flame trembles, guttering. You think of all the fires that have burned here, each one small against the cold, yet together enough to light generations of nights. Frightis joins you, pulling her cloak tight. The ships made good trade this year, she says. Will last the winter. Yes, you answer, though you're not sure whether you mean the settlement or something larger. She follows your gaze to the sea. Do you think anyone will remember us when these halls fall? You smile faintly. Someone will find the nails. Weeks later, a storm comes without warning. The wind tears at the roofs, drives waves across the beach, throws driftwood high into the grass. When it ends, part of the pier is gone, but the boats survive. You and Kel walk the shore, salvaging what the sea has offered back. Among the debris, you find an old barrel lid scorched with a trader's mark. A simple circle with a cross through it, half erased by salt. You realize it is the same mark Einar uses for 20 on his birch bark. The sea has its own way of keeping records. Winter clamps down again. The world shrinks to the circle of the hearth. You repair nets, twist rope, melt snow for water. The rhythm is slower now, a heartbeat felt through wood and wool. Some nights Einar talks of the time he first came here, when Hafnvik was only 3 huts and a fire pit. We thought we'd make a town, he says. We made a habit instead. He laughs softly. Maybe that's the better thing. Outside, the aurora ripples green and white over the sea, and the ice crackles like distant applause. You lie awake listening to it, hearing in each crack the echo of oars, the whisper of markets, the hum of men weighing fur against salt. You imagine the same sounds repeating elsewhere, carried forward by others who will never know your names. Trade, after all, is memory turned into motion. By the first stirrings of spring, the priest returns, younger men with him this time. They carry new coins, bright, clean, identical. He lays one on the table. The metal glints in the firelight. From now on, he says, all markets under the king's peace will weigh by this. Einar studies it a long time before nodding. It's a fine coin, he admits, but it will make the scales heavier. The priest frowns, not understanding. When they leave, you watch them go until the trees swallow their shapes. Something inside you feels both lighter and emptied. The river road is still there, the sea beyond it still breathing. But you sense that the old web of barter, the quiet balance of need and patience, has begun to thin. Yet even as new laws spread like frost, the essential truths remain. People will still trade warmth for salt, hunger for hope, distance for connection. They will still follow rivers, still trust the grain of wood under their palms, still weigh one life against another in the tilt of a scale. On the first clear evening after the thaw, you walk again to the pier rebuilt from stormwood. The air smells of tar and wet earth. Across the water, the setting sun lays a golden path toward the south. The same direction every trade wind follows. You take the old token from your pouch, the one with both ship and cross, and set it on the pier. The wood darkens as a wave touches it, then carries it away. For a heartbeat it floats, glinting, then vanishes into the glittering dusk. Behind you, someone calls your name. Einar, perhaps, or Fritis. You turn, but the sound folds into the steady breath of the sea. You listen a moment longer, letting the hush settle over everything. The boats, the hall, the endless road of fur and salt stretching invisibly into memory, and you wonder, as night gathers and the first stars spark over the water, when men finally learn to weigh everything, will they still remember the worth of things that cannot be measured? The first snow comes early while the sea is still restless. It begins as fine dust on the wind, grains that sting the skin and vanish before they can settle. By the second day, the dust thickens to flakes and the color of the world begins to change. The sky loses its edge. The horizon dissolves. Footprints fill faster than they're made, and sound carries differently, muted as though the air itself is tired. Winter in the north does not arrive all at once. It creeps in like a rumor, spreading quietly from the mountains to the fjords, from the farms to the sea. By the time people realize it has come, it has already locked the doors. Inside the longhouse of Hoffenvik, everything contracts. The great doorway is sealed with a hide curtain. The floor is covered in straw and rushes to hold what little warmth the fire offers. The days shrink so fast that no one bothers counting them. They are measured now in candles burned, not hours past. Outside, the wind carves the snow into shapes that look like waves, so that even the land begins to imitate the frozen sea. You rise before dawn because dawn, this time of year, is a slow and uncertain thing. The first light that touches the rafters is gray, and it stays gray all day. The air in the hall smells of smoke and boiled fish. A few sparks still sleep in the hearth. You crouch beside them and feed them shavings of pine, breathing gently until they catch. The small flare of warmth feels almost personal, like being remembered. Freda stirs awake behind you, wrapped in furs. "Still dark?" she asks, though she doesn't need an answer. "Still dark," you say anyway. In winter, the work of the settlement becomes inward. Nets are mended, clothes patched, stories repeated. The men scrape rust from tools, carve handles, repair sled runners. The women twist wool into thread, weave ropes, tend to drying racks hung with fish from the autumn catch. Outside, even the dogs move less. Their world has shrunk to a ring of trampled snow around the hall. The wind, when it comes, has a voice. Some call it a god, others a warning. It slips through the cracks of the roof and tastes of salt. At night, it finds the small spaces between words, filling the silences during meals. When it howls, conversation stops, and people listen with the stillness of prey. The North demands that kind of respect. Einar, older now, keeps the rhythm of survival the way a priest keeps the rhythm of prayer. Every morning he checks the stores, measuring fish and grain by hand. "Enough," he murmurs when the balance is right. "Not enough when it's not." Those two phrases hold the entire vocabulary of winter. By mid-season, the cold grows heavier, a presence you can feel even through wool. The sea freezes along the shallows, and the wind off the ice burns the lungs. The sun appears for an hour, sometimes less, a pale coin rolling along the edge of the sky before vanishing again. No one marks days anymore, only storms. The greatest enemy is not hunger or frost, but sameness. When every hour feels like the one before, memory begins to blur. Men forget what day it is. Women forget whether they've mended a shirt or only thought about mending it. Time becomes a circle drawn around the fire. To fight the sameness, stories return, old ones worn thin with retelling. Around the hearth at night, people speak of summers long gone, of boats heavy with silver, of journeys south where the grass stayed green all year. Some stories drift further into the half-believed, of spirits walking the snowfields, of whales frozen upright beneath the ice, of voices in the wind that remember the dead. No one admits to believing them, but no one dares to laugh either. The dark makes all things possible. You take your turn telling, as everyone must. You speak of the first settlers who found this coast, of the way they built homes from driftwood and rock, of the winters when the sea froze so thick men walked to the islands on its back. Your voice is steady, slow. The fire pops. Someone yawns. Freda smiles faintly and closes her eyes. It doesn't matter whether she sleeps or listens. The story is a lullaby either way. Sometimes in the deep night you wake without reason. The fire has burned low, leaving only embers like eyes. The hall is filled with quiet breathing. Outside, the ice shifts, cracking with sounds like distant thunder. You lie still, feeling the world expand and contract with each creak of the timbers. It is not frightening exactly, only vast. You understand why the old poet spoke of winter as a god. It has the same indifference. There are small rituals that keep people alive when warmth and sunlight cannot. One is the care of the lamps. Each evening, Freitas trims the wicks and refills them with fish oil. She does it with the precision of a surgeon, never wasting a drop. The lamps are placed evenly around the hall, their light soft and golden. For a few hours each night, the world seems gentle again. Children play quietly in the glow. The men drink thin ale and talk of repairs for spring. When the oil runs low, Fridas pinches each flame with a twist of damp fingers. The smell of smoke clings to her hands like memory. The second ritual belongs to Einar. Once every few nights he walks outside alone, no matter how fierce the cold. He says it's to check the roofs, but everyone knows he goes to listen, to make sure the sea is still there. The wind off the ice can erase even the sound of waves, and without that sound, some say a man can lose his soul. When he returns, his beard is white with frost, but his eyes are clear. Still breathing, he says, and everyone exhales with him. As weeks pass, small sicknesses spread, coughs, fevers, aching joints. Nothing deadly yet, just the slow toll of air too stale and rooms too crowded. The hall smells of sweat and smoke and medicine herbs hung from the rafters. Freydis boils pine needles in water to make a bitter drink that clears the chest. The taste is awful, but it helps. Survival is made of such compromises. One evening, a young man named Torfi tries to leave. He says he's going hunting, though there is nothing left to hunt. The others try to stop him, but he insists. I need air, he says. I need to see something move. He takes a spear and a lamp and disappears into the snow. The lamp glow lasts 10 heartbeats, then fades. By morning, he has not returned. Einar gathers a search party, but the wind is already rising. He won't have gone far, Kjell says, though his voice lacks conviction. They find Torfi 2 hours later, sitting upright against a drift, eyes open, body stiff. There are no wounds, only cold. His face looks peaceful, almost surprised. They carry him back on a sled. That night, no one tells stories. After Torfi's burial, a shallow grave of snow and stones, something changes in the hall. Laughter becomes quieter, movement slower. No one speaks of hunting anymore. Instead, they speak of spring as if it were a person overdue for a visit. When she comes, Freydis says, I'll scrub the walls until they shine. Einar nods but says nothing. The silence afterward feels heavy like snow on the roof. Then, one morning, you wake to a sound you haven't heard in months. The faint drip of water. The roof beams weep in slow rhythm. Outside, a gray line of sky shows at the horizon. The sea groans under its crust of ice. When you step outside, the air smells different. Not warmer yet, but looser, carrying a promise rather than a threat. The snow still reaches your knees, but beneath it, you hear trickles of hidden streams. Somewhere a raven calls. The sound breaks like glass, startling in its clarity. Inside, Einar says nothing, only nods to himself. He knows better than to name hope aloud. But that night, the fire burns longer than usual, and no one stops it. Even in boredom, there are moments that feel like miracles. You lie awake again, staring at the ceiling. The shadows of the rafters look like rivers winding across the wood. You think of Torfi, of the stories told, of the endless sameness of the nights. You wonder why people keep living in such places, where each year is a rehearsal of the last. But as you listen to the faint drip of thawing ice, you understand the answer. Because staying means being part of something that endures even when nothing else does. Outside, the snow continues to fall, though lighter now, gentler. It covers everything, the roof, the sea, the footprints left earlier that day. It even softens the grave by the shore. The wind moves through the cracks again, but this time its voice sounds less like warning, more like a lullaby. And you wonder, as sleep takes you under the low red glow of the hearth, what becomes of people who spent half their lives waiting for the world to wake? The first thaw was a lie. 3 days after the drip of melting began, the sky closed again, sealing the world back into silence. The frost returned harder, meaner, as though punishing the settlement for daring to hope. The snow hardened into a crust sharp enough to cut skin, and the sea froze in a single night, locking the inlet solid from shore to horizon. The fire inside the longhouse became the only proof that time still moved forward. You wake one morning to find your breath hanging in the air like smoke, even with the hearth burning. The air inside the hall feels heavy, filled with the taste of soot. People move slower now. The long winter has turned from season to condition, not weather anymore, but a way of life. Einar marks the days with small scratches on a beam above the hearth. No one counts them anymore, yet he keeps adding lines. When we stop marking, he says, the days stop happening. The others accept this logic. Even boredom becomes ritual here. Freydis's hands have cracked from cold. She rubs them with seal fat, then returns to her work spinning wool. The rhythm of the spindle is hypnotic. Twist, pull, twist again. It sounds like the ticking of a clock that doesn't measure time but keeps it from dissolving. Her thread joins the others hanging in loops near the rafters, bright against the smoke-blackened wood. "Color," she says when she catches you watching. "So we don't forget there are other seasons." At midday, if the gray light holds, the men go outside to split ice for water. The sound of the axe striking the frozen layer echoes across the bay. Each blow is sharp, final, clean. Beneath the ice, the water still moves, black and patient. They scoop it up in wooden pails, careful not to let the edges touch skin. More than once, someone has lost a fingertip to frostbite. The sea bites back. Kel mutters each time, half in humor, half in warning. Food grows scarcer. The barrels of dried fish and rye dwindle. Freitas measures the remaining grain by handfuls, not scoops. The meals become thin, broth more water than flavor, yet no one complains. Hunger has a way of teaching silence. Only the dogs whine, their ribs showing even through fur. When one dies, Einar orders it buried in the snow rather than eaten. "We'll keep our dignity," he says simply. No one argues. Still, the cold plays tricks. One night you wake to the sound of laughter. Soft, distant, impossible. You rise and listen. It's outside near the shore. The moonlight glints on the frozen sea, pale and sharp as a knife's edge. You see no one. The sound fades, swallowed by the wind. When you mention it the next morning, Freitas only nods. "Voices travel on ice," she says. "Sometimes they belong to the living, sometimes not." Einar listens too, but says nothing. Later, when the hall is empty, he steps outside and presses his ear to the ice. He stays that way for a long time. When he returns, his expression is unreadable. "It's moving," he says finally, "even if we can't see it." As days blend together, small things begin to matter disproportionately. A nail hammered straight, a spark that catches on the first try, a loaf that rises properly in the heat. Each success feels enormous, proof that the world hasn't forgotten them. People find comfort in small repairs, patching holes in the roof, sewing buttons, carving new handles for old tools. "The trick," Kel says one evening, "is to keep pretending we're doing something that matters." You agree, but quietly wonder whether pretending is the only thing that keeps men alive. The dark stretches longer now. Night arrives in the middle of the afternoon. Lamps burn through the oil faster than expected, and Freitas begins mixing in tallow to stretch the supply. The smoke from it clings to the ceiling in a greasy haze. You cough often. Everyone does. The air smells of fat and ash and the faint sweetness of decay. Even so, the glow of the lamps feels like mercy. "We burn what we have," Einar says. "That's all survival is." One evening, a blizzard arrives without warning. The door slams open, snow pouring in like smoke. Einar and Kjell push it shut against the wind, their shoulders braced, faces white with frost. The storm rages for 2 days straight. Inside, the hall groans, the roof sagging under the weight. People sleep sitting upright, too afraid to lie down. Outside, the world disappears. The sound of the wind becomes endless. Not loud, just relentless. A low, unbroken moan that seeps into dreams. On the second night, the roof gives a sharp crack. A beam splinters, showering sparks from the fire. Everyone jumps to their feet. Einar shouts orders, buckets, ropes, hands. For an hour, chaos. Then slowly the noise fades, the roof holds, the storm begins to die. When silence finally returns, it's so pure it feels unnatural. In the morning, snow has sealed the door from outside. It takes 2 men an hour to dig through. The first light that spills in looks almost holy. The world beyond is transformed and smooth, white, untouched. The huts look half buried. The pier has vanished entirely, but there's no damage that can't be mended. Everyone exhales at once, as if remembering how to breathe. That evening, the air inside the hall feels lighter. Someone hums while mending a net. Someone else laughs when a spark lands on his sleeve. The laughter feels strange at first, then natural. "We've lived through worse," Freitas says, though no one can recall when. A few days later, Einar calls everyone to the shore. The snow is knee-deep, but the path is clear. He points toward the horizon, where faint cracks shimmer across the ice. "Listen," he says. The sea groans again, the sound low, deep, alive. It's breaking, not fully, but enough to remind everyone that the thaw will come. The sound rolls beneath the ice like thunder beneath water. It's a promise wrapped in warning. That night, people sleep easier. Even the dogs stop whining. Hope in the north arrives not as warmth but as noise, the sound of something breaking open. The next morning brings a rare sunrise. It rises pale and enormous over the frozen bay. turning every drift pink and gold. The air glitters with frost. Freda stands beside you, her breath clouding in the light. "It's beautiful," she says quietly. "Almost cruel how beautiful." You nod. "The world still remembers us." "For now," she replies. As the sun climbs higher, people begin to work again. Nets are spread to dry by the shore. Barrels are checked. Tools sharpened. There's energy in the settlement again. Cautious but real. The endless winter hasn't ended yet, but its spell has weakened. That night you find Einar alone by the fire, carving something small from driftwood. "What is it?" you ask. He shrugs. "A sun, maybe. Or a wheel. Or nothing at all." He sets it down beside the hearth. "We used to carve these in the old days, before the new gods came. Just a way of asking the light to find us again." You study the small circle of wood, rough but deliberate. "Does it work?" He smiles faintly. "We're still here, aren't we?" Outside, the temperature drops again, but the stars are visible for the first time in weeks. Hard, bright points scattered across an endless sky. You stand under them a long time, the cold biting through your clothes, the air so still you can hear your own pulse. The world feels fragile but awake. Back inside, the hall glows with low firelight. The carved sun sits on the stone ledge, its edges shining faintly. The people of Hoffenvik sleep side by side, wrapped in furs, their breaths rising and falling together in a rhythm older than memory. You listen, letting the sound settle into you like a lullaby, and you think, before sleep takes you, perhaps survival is not about outlasting the cold, but about learning how to keep a fire burning in a world that forgets warmth. The cold loosens its grip in brief, almost embarrassed stages, as if winter itself is reluctant to admit defeat. Every day you test the world with small experiments. You set a shallow pan of snow near the hearth and watch how quickly it surrenders. You push a pole through the inlet's crust to discover whether the water below resists. You stand outside and count your breaths before your fingers lose feeling. Survival by now is a collection of measurements rather than a single triumph. One morning you find the door not frozen to its frame. The leather hinge gives with a quiet sigh, and the air that slips in carries the smell of wet timber and old seaweed. There is a thin glaze of ice on the threshold that doesn't bite your boot as sharply as it did the week before. These are facts, not omens, though people treat them with the same caution. In Hoffenvik, too much hope is like too much ale. It unsettles the judgment. Einar speaks less these days, but you can see the arithmetic working behind his eyes. He takes inventory not only of fish and grain, but of bodies, who limps, who coughs, who rises slower from the straw. He watches hands because hands tell the truth sooner than mouths do. When he passes Freitas, he taps the rim of the grain bin twice. She nods. The gesture means we are close but not yet in danger. It is a small luxury to be so near to spring and still own that word. Not yet. You repair the sled runners, though you hope not to need them. The wood has dried and split at the tips, so you warm pitch with a coal and work it into the cracks. Pitch cools quickly in cold air, turning from liquid to tarry thread to hard shine in a handful of heartbeats. The process feels like a conversation with the season. Each stroke says we are not finished. From somewhere far out on the bay comes a sound like a drum struck beneath water. The ice is shifting again. People step into the doorway to listen, heads tilted, the way they might stand in silence for a prayer. The sound doesn't promise anything specific, but it does promise motion. In the north, motion is a kind of mercy. That night, Freitas loosens the lamps earlier than usual. She cleans the wicks with a bone pick, rubbing the soot from her fingers with a scrap of coarse cloth. "We'll have to switch to tallow again tomorrow," she says without complaint. The fish oil is down to the last jar. You nod and fetch it from the cool corner where oils live through winter. It glows the faint yellow of stored sunlight when you lift the lid. You save the sight of it because the smell is not the thing you want to remember. Kjell comes in from the dark with snow dusting his beard like salt. "Cracks all the way to the second spit," he reports. 2 days of this and we can cut a channel." Einar grunts, which in his language is an agreement at once hopeful and skeptical. No one mentions boats yet. Boats are spring's vocabulary, and spring hasn't declared itself. You sleep badly, the mind rehearsing tasks it cannot yet do. When at last the fire's warmth collapses and the hall falls back into its ordinary dimness, you rise and dress in the slow, practiced order. Wool, then skin, then fur. The sequence that kept you alive when ideas could not. Outside, dawn presents itself with the modesty of a servant. The dogs lift their heads and decide this light is not yet worth celebrating. Work finds you before you can seek it. A seam near the roof hole has shrunk and opened, so snow sifted down overnight, melting into a treacherous wet patch on the floor. You climb the interior ladder, knees stiff, hands sticky with pitch and cold. Up close, the old wood looks like a kind of writing. Strakes and pegs and scars, sentences made by knives and seasons. You press lichen-crammed moss into the seam and tamp it hard with the back of a spoon. When you descend, your wrists ache, but the drip has stopped. A fixed leak is as good as a feast. The settlement eats early and thin. A pot of barley has been coaxed into thickening with a fist of dried leaves and a rationed pinch of salt. Nobody says the word delicious, but nobody complains either. Children lean over their bowls and breathe the steam as if it were a gift. Outside, the ice drums again. A child asks if the sea is singing. It is learning to, Friday says. The answer pleases everyone, including the adults. The day's big labor is water. The snow near the door is gray with footwork and ash. So you carry a sled to the edge of the inlet where the ice is strongest and cleanest. You strike with a broad-headed axe, lifting and dropping until the surface crazes into spiderweb lines and loosens into panes. The first slab you pry free is clear as glass and heavy as regret. Below it, the water moves with exaggerated patience, as if wary of drawing attention. You fill buckets until your arms complain, then lash them to the sled and drag your way back across the hard crust. Your breath plumes. Frost gathers on your mustache and then melts, wetting your lip with a taste like iron. By afternoon, an argument begins. Not angry, only necessary. It is about whether to begin moving barrels toward the shore, whether to risk working the boats down from their winter cradles. A barrel moved too soon is a barrel moved twice, and backs have only so many lifts in them before spring. Einar settles it by taking a step outside, standing still for a full count of 60 and then returning. Tomorrow, he says. Not today. No one disagrees. It is a relief to be told not yet. The wind rises and dies, rises and dies. You learn to trust the thickness of the silence that follows each gust. When the quiet deepens to a particular velvet, snow is on the way. You tell Kjell this. He nods as if you've reminded him of his own childhood. The snow arrives at dusk. Not a blizzard, just a steady, competent fall. The sort of weather that argues for soup and patience. Inside, the hall grows warmer than it has in weeks. The fire cooperates. The logs offer their stored summers without fuss. For an unreasonable hour, the world feels gentle. In that hour, stories resume without being asked. A young woman describes how her mother used to cook a flat cake on a stone by the hearth and sweeten it with a smear of honey reserved for midwinter. She describes the loop of steam that rose from it, and how the steam always made her think of a white spirit leaving the batter. No one laughs. The memory is a kind of food, and you can feel it settle in the room like a second fire. Einar takes his turn and surprises you by talking about a man he once traded with at Reeb, who could tell coin by sound alone. He'd close his eyes, Einar says, and ask you to drop a piece from a finger's height into a shallow bowl. He could tell silver from silver plated by the difference in the ring. Einar passes a coin between fingers that have handled winter longer than most men handle knives. I thought he was a wizard, he says, not quite smiling. But he was only careful. When people drift off to sleep, you stay where you are a little longer. The fire is now a red map of small cities, coals glowing in clusters that look like settlements seen from a hill. You remember Torfi, the brief idea of his body sitting upright in the white. You remember the way Freydis's face altered for days after, not softer but thinner, the expression of someone whose savings have been spent. You speak his name beneath your breath and the sound sketches a shape in the air that the room accepts and then quietly erases. In the deep of night, the wind pushes a thought through the roof seam. The smell of open water, you know it instantly, in the same way you would know the smell of a loved one's hair. You rise and ease the door open. The inlet is a single sheet under a gray moon, but along the far spit a ribbon shines where the surface is broken and refrozen again. The ice shivers. A tremor passes under your boots. You are not afraid. The world is rehearsing its thaw. At first light, Einar announces the verdict he made yesterday, today. The settlement becomes a machine. Men lever hulls from their winter cradles with oars and wedges. Women pull tarred lines from hooks and warm them near the hearth so they will bend without cracking. Children fetch pegs and pins with a competence that will one day be called tradition. The boats complain, wood against wood, but they move. A keel kisses the sled runners and is guided toward the shore as respectfully as a body toward a grave. The channel cutting begins where the ice looks least sure. Heavy poles, iron hooks, a rhythm learned from fathers who didn't learn it from books. When the first slab tilts and slides under the next, the water that rises is black enough to be a different element. Men whoop once and then shut their mouths as if laughter might encourage the ice to change its mind. The work is monotonous and blessed. You sweat inside your fur. Steam rises from the poles after each plunge. The air smells of iron, brine, breath. By midday, a corridor of water snakes from the shallows to the first open patch. It is not wide enough for a boat yet, but it is an honest start. You eat standing up, cold fish, colder bread, a swallow of ale whose thinness would embarrass summer. No one sits. Sitting belongs to winter. Standing is what you do when a season changes. As the light tilts toward afternoon, the inlet speaks again. A deeper note. Cracks jump from one glazed ridge to another with the speed of startled animals. A sheet nearer the spit lifts a finger's width and then settles. Einar raises his hand and everyone stills. The sea decides in one long minute. The ice sighs as if exhaling weeks of the breath it has held. When Einar drops his hand, the tools move a fraction faster. It is not hope you feel precisely. It is recognition, the shape of survival returning to its old outlines. The dogs sense it too. They trot more than they walk. One plunges a forepaw through a thin place and snatches back with a bark that sounds like laughter. A child scolds it with a vocabulary borrowed from adults, and the adults pretend not to be amused because pretending is also a ritual. By the time the light gives out, the channel is a promise you can point at. You drag the boats back up the nearest patch of hard ground and turn them on their sides to drain the day's melt. You rub your hands and they sting in a way that suggests the body is not yet convinced of spring. Inside, Fridas has saved a heel of cheese for the evening and pretends she hasn't. She cuts it into equal portions with a blade that has been sharpened too many times to remember its original shape. When she hands you your slice, she says, "For Torfi," and you answer, "For Torfi," because the dead also have to be accounted for in a place that loves numbers. The night after that, the temperature falls harder than anyone expected. It is not betrayal. Seasons do not make promises, but it feels like one. You wake to find the channel skinned over, a thin shell that breaks when tapped and then reforms around the edges with an insolent speed. People swear under their breath and then collect themselves. The tools come out again. The work repeats. No one says we were fools to start because the work would need doing tomorrow anyway. This is how the North corrects errors, by continuing. 2 days later, the thaw commits. The inlet opens in panels, an old window shaken until the stuck panes slide. The water is ugly at first, brown with what the ice has hidden. Soon it turns to the ordinary gray of a northern sea that has nothing to prove. The first boat goes in on a line, pushed and steadied and sung to in a tune without words. It floats like a decision made at last. Einar puts a hand on the gunwale as if taking an oath and nods to you. You climb in with Kel. The hull moves the way muscle moves under a dog's coat, silently pleased to be used again. You pull once on the oars, twice, 3 times. The sound of wood in the locks is both new and older than you are. Water parts without reluctance. Along the cut edge of the channel, shattered ice nods approval. Your breath fogs, then vanishes. The oars find a cadence they have been rehearsing in your sleep all winter. When you look back, the hull's roof hole makes a neat dark circle against the sky like a punctuation mark at the end of a long, difficult sentence. There is work waiting beyond the inlet, nets to test, stakes to reset, ropes to stretch until they remember their duties. There will be trade in time and arguments about price and law, and priests with tokens whose shapes mean different things to different hands. But not today. Today is for the first useful laps of water around a hull, for the small courtesy of waves tapping the bow like knuckles on a good door. You bring the boat in before dusk. The settlement meets you as if you've been gone a season, which is true in the ways that matter. Children reach to touch the wet hull as if it were an animal returned from winter pasture. Kel grins like a boy and refuses to notice that he is not one. Freydis pretends she needs help lifting a coil of line so she can place a hand briefly on the boat and say something only the wood needs to hear. That evening, the fire carries its heat higher into the roof. The lamps burn fish oil, not tallow, for the first time in weeks, and the shadows move like sails. Einar says nothing ceremonial. He only opens his palm and lays a single iron nail on the table. "We have enough to mend what breaks," he says. It sounds like wealth. You sleep with the sound of unfrozen water in your ears, a new lullaby braided with old ones, the hiss of pitch, the hush of wool, the scrape of a blade tested on a thumbnail. When you wake in the dark, You do not have to ask whether the sea is still there. You can feel it moving under your ribs. Spring will misbehave again. Storms will arrive sideways. Nets will tear at the worst moment. Prices will deviate from sense. And yet the line has been crossed. The settlement has taken its first step toward the season that allows choices rather than only endurance. The dead are counted, the living are busy, the tools are where hands expect to find them. In the north, that is a kind of peace. Before sleep claims you entirely, you consider everything winter taught and did not take. How to count without despair. How to tend a flame so small it looks like a mistake. How to trust the difference between silence and stillness. How to remember the worth of a warm cup passed from hand to hand without a word. You think about the others who will make this passage long after you are gone. People whose names the wood will know by the weight of their footsteps. People who will learn the same rituals with different songs. Perhaps one day someone digging at the edge of the hall will lift a fistful of bent nails and guess at all the roofs those nails persuaded to hold. The fire settles into a low red city again. You lie back and let your breath sink with the sleeping room. The last thing you think before the dark closes is not a vow or a prayer, but a question that feels as useful as a tool. If the memory of winter is what keeps the first fire of spring burning, what else should we remember when the year turns generous again?